Арабская ночь, волшебный восток. Здесь чары и месть, отвага и честь, дворцы и песок. О, дивный восток, о, сказочный край.
Such a beautiful day, the sun's shining in a beautiful way, gonna take a shower, brush my teeth, then
life is ultimately meaningless.
But I'll get out of the house, get on the road, top down, hands out, on my favorite song and nod to the rhythm.
The planet is being destroyed by your carbon emissions.
But I'll head to class, driving fast on every test till I pass, and my grades are screaming in my face. Hey!
98% of what you learn is a waste.
I get to hang out with all my friends. Yeah. My friends are the friendliest friends. Can't think of a better way to spend my time.
Your brain is flawed and all your friends will die.
Never mind, I'm alive in the greatest nation. So proud of
the exploitation of the natives.
This graceful bird means freedom for all.
Tell that to the slaves, and bald eagles aren't bald.
I can live in the moment, milk every second.
At any time you could get clinical depression.
But I'll just be happy no matter what's in store.
It's quite genetic and we have no cure.
At least we are young. Life is fun.
It goes downhill.
We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it.
Or you'll regret it.
We are young.
For now.
Life is fun.
For some people.
We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it. I got a brand new job today. Doing stuff that'll help the economy. I'll save money and buy things at the store.
Banks can crash and capitalism is flawed.
Crony capitalism. What is it? Why is it so bad? To answer these questions, let's think about good old-fashioned capitalism. It is premised on the free exchange of goods or services between independent agents. Let's say I want to buy some cereal. Steve's Grocery is selling my brand for $4. Ted's Grocery has it for $5. I buy from Steve, which creates the most value for both me and him. Meanwhile, Ted now has an incentive to cut his costs so he can compete better. Replicate this kind of transaction billions of times a day, 365 days a year, and that is how our economy functions and grows, or at least how it's supposed to. Now, what about crony capitalism? Let's say it's the government that wants to buy some cereal. More specifically, the House of Representatives Committee for Cereal Acquisition is put in charge of the task. Steve still sells for $4, Ted for $5. I buy from Steve. He's the low price man. But the Committee for Cereal Acquisition buys from Ted. Why? Because Ted lobbied the committee. Because his corporate headquarters is in the chairman's district. Because he gave more campaign contributions. Because he promised a lobbying gig to an undecided committee member who plans to retire next year. That is how crony capitalism works. And it happens all throughout the government, from defense contracting to farm subsidies, clean energy programs, infrastructure spending, affordable housing, food stamps, Medicare, Obamacare, tax policy. You pretty much name it, crony capitalism is there. Capitalism is moral because it is premised on a voluntary exchange between independent parties who agree to the deal only because it creates value for everybody. Crony capitalism is immoral because one of the parties, the government, has been bought off. This creates three problems. First, it is unfair. Politicians are spending the public's money, but not for the public interest. Instead, they reward friends, supporters, or themselves. Our Constitution grants Congress the power to provide for the general welfare. Crony capitalism violates this sacred principle. Second, it is incredibly wasteful. In our cereal example, the government overpaid by going with Ted instead of Steve. That's obviously a waste of taxpayer money. In fact, it is really stealing from the taxpayer. Here's more waste. Ted had to spend money to lobby the government to get the contract, so he didn't get all that dollar out of the transaction. That's money that could have been spent making a better product or used in some other constructive way. Economists call this deadweight loss, and it can be substantial. Moreover, crony capitalism distorts the broader economy. In some industries, like healthcare, student loans, home mortgages, and aerospace, the government is one of the biggest purchasers of goods or services, so its politicized decisions can have wide-ranging and detrimental effects. An entire industry can become, in effect, a client of the government. When that happens, its goal is not to build a better mousetrap, but to keep politicians happy. How much does crony capitalism cost society per year? It is hard to say precisely, but the number reaches into the tens of billions of dollars, maybe beyond. Third, it tempts politicians to break the law. Once politicians feel free to spend the public's money for their own political purposes, they are just a hop, skip, and a jump away from doing so to line their own pockets or pump up their campaign funds, or both. So what can we do? Our first task is to recognize that government must have limits. Of course, there has to be a national authority to set the parameters for society that establishes the rules of the game and enforces them. But when we expect the government to promote an industry, tinker with some sector of the economy, help some important voter group, we create the groundwork for crony capitalism and all the bad things that come with it: favoritism, waste, theft, and other forms of corruption. America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson, had a very useful perspective on this issue. There are no necessary evils in government, he said. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. Jackson had it right. A limited government confined to equal protection can't play favorites. Limited government. If getting rid of crony capitalism is the goal, it all starts there. I'm Jake Cost of the Weekly Standard for Prager University.
And it's all because of my hard work.
I have 1,000 advantages he looked into at birth.
I put a lot of effort in my resume.
Good thing you don't have a black person's name.
We've known for some time that affirmative action and diversity hiring are rife in large corporations, basically hiring people not based on merit, but based on things like skin color or gender. This is because, as we know, progressives believe that there is some kind of institutional subconscious bias and discrimination happening in which certain groups of people are not getting the same opportunities as others. So they decide to fix this invisible problem by destroying the notion of meritocracy and employing their own institutional discrimination against certain groups, usually men, and in particular, white men. How inclusive and enlightened of them. But the James Damore memo exposed just how intolerant these organizations are of anyone who disagrees with such policies. Damore wrote a 10-page manifesto that criticized the politically correct climate within Google, which included discussion of their hiring practices. The primary reason gender parity in technical fields is an unrealistic utopian notion really boils down to sexual dimorphism between the genders, as Damore pointed out in his memo. On average, men and women biologically differ in many ways. These differences aren't just socially constructed because they're universal across human cultures. They often have clear biological causes and links to prenatal testosterone. Biological males that were castrated at birth and raised as females often still identify and act like males. The underlying traits are highly heritable. They're exactly what we expect from an evolutionary psychology perspective. Unfortunately, at Google, scientific facts are a form of perpetuating dangerous gender stereotypes or some other such garbage. This is the reason Damore was fired.
Sort of to lay out how this whole thing got written and why you did it. First, you're working at Google for a while, and then they started sending you guys, not just you, but people, to diversity training. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, so can you explain what diversity training is?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated because there's multiple different programs, but it's often talking about how we have 50% of people in the population are women, but at Google we only have 20%. And so they discuss all of the sexism that's happening and how that's holding back women in general. And then they also have stuff about racism and all these other unconscious biases because, we don't really see anything like, oh, you're a woman, therefore you can't code. There's never these explicit forms of bias that we see. And we haven't really been able to measure actual bias at Google. So we just assume that there's some sort of low-level bias that's happening. And it's always really impossible to measure. But these programs go over that. They go over microaggressions and white male privilege, and then discuss how we can make the workplace better for women and how we can get more women on our teams, basically.
Yeah.
Doesn't it sound like a really swell place to work? Basically, Google is a product of the super leftist environment it's headquartered in, California. No one will talk about how men are overwhelmingly underrepresented in roles like psychology, teaching, childcare, and nursing, and the reasons as to why that is. But apparently gender discrimination is entirely a one-way street. In effect, what SJWs and gender ideologues are suggesting is that there's no difference between men and women at the level of the brain because gender is a social construct. Last year I made a silly short sketch about how two guys attempt to buy tickets for a sporting event from a ticket tout, but he won't sell them the tickets because the government has forced him to sell them only to women in order to achieve 50-50 male-female attendance in all the sports stadiums. Yes, there's lots of women who like sports, and probably some men who like soap operas, makeup tutorial videos on YouTube, and reading 50 Shades of Grey, but let's be real here. We're talking about the average, not the outliers. Obviously, the purpose of the sketch is to highlight the fact that men and women have different interests, and to attempt to achieve some kind of equality of outcome is nothing but a denial of this fact and a form of social engineering. You might even interpret Google's mentality as the belief that if women don't succeed in traditionally male-dominated technical fields, then their career is a failure. How can they not see how offensive they're being? Legitimately offensive, as opposed to the easily triggered special snowflake interpretation. To be honest, it's hard to know just how much Google staff actually believe what they propose. Damore maintains he did receive support from some fellow Google employees, suggesting that there are many more wrong thinkers within the organization and that it's a fairly divided house. Obviously, they don't fancy being fired as he was, so they kept quiet, but I suspect more ex-Google staff will come out and speak publicly on all of this kind of stuff in due course. The precedent has been set, so we can probably expect more insiders, leakers, and whistleblowers before too long. A quick web search for the topic of diversity hiring and Silicon Valley reveals that the mainstream press are either brainwashed or simply towing the PC line. The long march of cultural Marxism through academic institutions has spilled over into corporate culture, and by firing Damore, it's officially taken the gloves off, revealing its true authoritarian face. Political correctness, as Charlton Heston described it, is nothing but tyranny in manners. So what happens when a company accidentally reveals what it really thinks of this progressive hiring policy? Well, you get this hilarious and embarrassing fail by Amazon. Dear Diversity Hire, Amazon's weapons-grade fail in recruitment email to woman techie. Attempt to lure more diverse workers backfires. An email shared online earlier today was sent by an Amazon Web Services recruiter to a woman encouraging her to apply for a software engineering position. The message kicked off with the subject line, "Diversity Hire, Job Software Engineer at Amazon." It may as well have started with, "Dear Token Minority." The register asked Amazon to shed more light on the poorly worded email. A spokesperson said they would get back to us. In the meantime, LREG has contacted the email's recipient. She was not immediately available for comment. However, we understand the email is legit and it was sent by a temporary recruiter. It was not approved by any higher-ups and does not conform to the cloud giant's official hiring practices. If I had to guess as to what happened here, and I could be wrong, I would wager that Amazon's recruiting team had created a template email to be sent to certain candidates that they considered to be diversity hires. And these stock template emails each begin with diversity hire, which is a piece of text that's supposed to be removed and populated with the candidate's actual name in order to personalize it, obviously. This wasn't done because of an oversight by the sender of the email, but it provides an insight into the thinking behind the hiring policies of Amazon. What these organizations cannot fathom is that when you provide equality of opportunity, which women already have in the Western world, you will not end up with equality of outcome. It's that simple. Because of affirmative action for women, we've got big problems in the future. It begins in academia, as I've mentioned before, from the BBC last year. Why are women getting so many more university places than men? This isn't just a slight difference. Women in the UK are now 35% more likely than men to go to university, and the gap is widening every year. A baby girl born in 2016 will be 75% more likely to go to university than a boy if current trends continue. The Higher Education Policy Institute has published research examining this increasingly polarized gender divide. And as university remains the gateway to better paid, more secure jobs, Mary Kerna-Cook, head of the UCAS University Admissions Service, warns that being male could be a new form of disadvantage. On current trends, the gap between rich and poor will be eclipsed by the gap between males and females within a decade, she says. Who exactly is supposed to have the babies when women comprise the vast majority of a country's skilled workforce? Women generally tend not to marry men who earn less than they do, so articles about how career women are struggling to find suitable high-achieving men at the top of the corporate ladder suggest an awful lot of unhappy and lonely cat ladies in the offing. At some point, many of these women are going to want to drop out of the working world and have children, and unless they're willing to marry below their status, to use such a god-awful term, it's going to be hard to see things working out well for the nuclear family, and things just look awful for men in the future. What happens to all the unemployed, uneducated, and therefore unemployable men lying around in society? Affirmative action is pure cancer, but ironically enough, in order to correct this problem in the future, there may need to be affirmative action for men someday. Then hopefully we can just toss the policy in the trash where it belongs. Of course, all of this could have been avoided if we just stopped denying the truth and left men and women to their own devices.
I'm proud to be a functioning member of society. Finally, I can be the citizen I dream to be. Part of the community, contribute with my tax. What could possibly stop me?
The shrinking middle class.
At least I got a nice stable job.
Till it's outsourced to China or replaced by a robot.
Oh god, well, then I could relax a bit.
You'll be empty with nothing to distract from it.
But man, I'm a passionate graduate. I could be different and I have career paths to pick from. I could be a rapper or an animator if I'm lucky.
Neither of those will make you happy, trust me.
I'm able to choose what I pursue.
You're a slave to people born richer than you.
Then screw it! I'll keep going in, then I'll party on the weekend and sing.
Thanks to auto-tune.
We are young. Life is fun.
It goes downhill.
We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it.
Or you'll regret it.
We are young.
Still die.
Life is fun.
Until you die.
We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it.
Because you'll die.
Life is a wonder.
You'll never know the answer.
Nature is a miracle.
Natural disasters.
It's good to be alive.
Could wake up with cancer.
But I'm healthy.
Healthy people still get cancer.
I love this show.
It's the last episode.
The sun is shining.
It's going to explode.
Every species is beautiful and unique though.
Children have malaria thanks to mosquitoes.
I met a cute girl with a ponytail.
Statistically, that relationship is going to fail.
I have a wonderful family, it's like no other.
You're not special and one day you'll bury your mother.
No matter what, I can find a home.
We will all die alone.
There's amazing potential in every human on Earth.
There's no escaping the heat death of the universe.
I don't have to live life based on negative parts. No matter how bad they are, they're just thoughts.
Yeah, that's fair.
Wait, really?
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Wait, but you were just telling me
Whatever, man. I don't know. Live your life how you want. I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm just saying.
Oh. Well, in that case... We are young. Life is fun. We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it. We are young. Life is fun. We gotta make the most of it, make the most of it.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
What's more annoying than the debate itself is the fact that people think their opinions matter on the fucking internet. Think about what you could have done in that 2 hours you spent writing paragraphs on about fucking Bernie Sanders. You're so discontent with your life that you're arguing with people you've never seen before online. Are you a fucking idiot? Who the fuck hurt you?
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.